Welcome to Female Athlete Stories, a special series of the Endurance Drive podcast. I'm Katie.
And I'm Elena.
And here we are at episode 4?
Episode 4, we're rocking and rolling.
Yeah, this has been fun. And I feel like I'm a lot less nervous than I was for the first couple. So it's actually just fun now.
Yeah, it's nice to settle in. And I also got to hang with you this week. So I take it you got back to Massachusetts okay?
I did. Yeah, it was funny because on our last episode, we said, we're going to take a run together because we're both endurance athletes. And then we just ended up going downhill skiing for the whole day because that's what you do when you're in Utah.
Which was excellent. Yeah, no complaints there. Honestly, the snow was really good. And I was thinking about running that day and it wasn't going to happen. And I had much more fun skiing with you. So I'm glad we did that.
And broader point is that modifications like that are awesome and fun and okay. I think this was one of the few times in my life that I just did skiing for 4 days and took some days off, and it was really awesome. So glad to do that.
Yeah, I also will say I think that is good training. I am on the skiing train for training. So yeah, if people are going skiing for a week, remember that's giving you some fatigue resistance. So frame it however you want.
I was really sore, to be honest.
Good.
So I think we should probably move into our topic for today because we have a lot of different sort of subtopics that we're going to cover. But the title of this episode is The Forces That We're Up Against. And so we're basically going to hit a few different topics that all relate to forces that women athletes tend to experience in navigating the world of sport. So our very first one is to talk a little bit more about body image. We had talked about it on our second episode, The Female Body, but I think we're interested in thinking about it more from a lens of the outsider and how women's bodies are perceived, and dive into some of the stories that we got from people in our network.
Yeah, this is a big one. And I know we said a lot of things came through our form, but when we talk about challenges, I feel like so many of them were just hitting on this lens in different ways. So body image is a big topic, and we know it affects so many of the people in our community, men and women alike, but I think it definitely proportionally affects women.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I think we'll start maybe by reading this quote that we got. One of our submitters said, "One thing I've struggled with, not as much anymore, but definitely as I was starting to get into the sport, was body image. I wanted to participate in sports, and I was excited to get into swimming, biking, and running, but I also became hyper-aware and critical of how my body looked and the ways in which I saw it changing, like broader shoulders because of swimming. I remember feeling this intense conflict. I loved swimming, and I wanted to do it, but I was finding myself hating the way my body was changing, mostly because it was changing in ways that run counter to how society says women should look, tiny backs, shoulders, and arms that look like they will break. I was starting to hate my body that was getting stronger and allowing me to take on bigger challenges. I also found that people were constantly commenting on my body, like, oh, wow, you look so strong. Your arms are so big. Your back is so broad. Which, yes, maybe some people would take as a compliment, but it came at a particularly vulnerable time for me. I didn't want that type of attention on my body. I didn't feel like people would be commenting that much on a man's body. It was definitely challenging for a bit. But I worked through it by being more motivated to do bigger, harder adventures that require me to feel well versus keep my body small. I learned to love feeling strong and not see it as something that is masculine. I've learned to love and accept the strength of my body and what it allows me to do. I learned that strong is sexy." So I love this quote, and thank you so much to the submitter who gave us this one, because I think we all can really relate to a lot of these feelings.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a powerful one. And learning that strong is sexy, that is a journey in itself that I think we've all been on in some way, shape, or form. So yeah, thanks to this listener, and definitely relatable.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot that we can kind of pull out of this. There's first just the internal perceptions of how your body might change as you do more training. And then there's also just that external perspective of people wanting to comment on it. And I think what a lot of people may not always realize is that comments about body, even if they seem positive, like, oh, wow, you look so strong, your arms are so big, your back is so broad, they can affect people in a lot of different ways. And I think for us, probably a good rule of thumb is just don't comment on body. We've talked about this before, but it's maybe best to avoid.
Yeah, your sausage legs comment. What was that?
I feel like that one was more on the negative side, to be completely honest. But yeah,
yeah, I guess you wouldn't take that as a compliment. But yes, it's just don't comment on body.
Yeah, or just being oh, you've gotten so much stronger. Look at those. Just things like that, I think, can be even kind of triggering for people. So maybe our advice to the entire world is let's not do that. Let's comment on performance and other features.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you feel like you've experienced discomfort in your body getting stronger, or what does that journey look like for you?
Yeah, it's interesting. And this is something that I've heard from a lot of endurance athletes and definitely have experienced too. I think sometimes getting stronger can be tied up in how you think about weight, because muscle weighs more and you can go faster with more muscle and stuff. But if we're always sort of conditioned to think like you want that number on the scale to be lower or you want to be smaller, I think it can sometimes be challenging to reckon with just like, oh, weight is changing in the context of getting stronger. And so for that, I think we can say like weight is often not actually that useful of a metric to spend a lot of time thinking about because we want to be thinking about strength and performance. But yeah, it's just been interesting to navigate that change.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, on the weight side too, like I haven't looked at a scale in a while, although I did recently when I lost a bunch of weight being really sick and actually was triggered by losing weight. And I thought it was a really interesting journey that I kind of came through on the other side of. But I think now I weigh about what I weighed when I was coming to play hockey as a freshman in college. And that's after having a whole journey where I lost weight. And then I think I've gained weight back to like my set point. And it's just funny how when you let your body do its own thing, I feel so much fitter than I did when I was a freshman in college. And it's been a weird journey, but yeah, it came back to basically the same place, but maybe in a different way, shape, or form. And my performance feels so much better and my weight has not changed. So I think that's interesting.
Yeah. And I think like if it's challenging, we've talked about this before, but like you don't actually need a scale in order to like perform and do really well. I think just ground in all these other data points that we can think about. There's good data and there's bad data out there, but that's one that I'd say is more on the bad data side.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there was another quote that we liked where kind of hitting on this tension between performance and looks. It says, I often feel that there is an expectation that if I wear something cute running, I better excel at that activity. Otherwise, my outfit is just attention seeking. I was once running in short shorts because it was a long run in the desert in the summer, aka it was hot, and a male mountain biker told me at a trail junction, from the looks of you in those shorts, I didn't know what to expect, but you're fast. I was so angry, I had not even considered a correlation between looks and performance. As I have faced health challenges and have demonstrably slowed, I feel this pressure more. Should I look drab to match my performance? That is interesting and sad. I mean, I'm so upset that this mountain biker said that to her too. Like, I just feel the heebie-jeebies in my body already. I'm cringing.
Yeah. My heart goes out to this listener. And I think we know that anytime we go out and do stuff, there are going to be people that are looking. I've certainly felt a little weird about, going for a run in a sports bra in a city for me is very different from going for a run in a sports bra on like a rural road in Vermont or something, because there are always people that are going to look at your body before they look at your face, before they try to smile at you. Maybe they smile at you in a creepy way, but it's something that I'm much more conscious of just because I think we've probably all had experiences of people making assumptions about our bodies. So if you put them out there in what you're wearing, even if that's something really comfortable for you or it's hot, it's a big tension.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've even had people be like, you're wearing something tight, like as if like that's like a negative thing, but it's like, well, it's honestly the most comfortable thing to run in for a reason, for me at least. And like you don't have to by any means, but yeah, I feel like that is something that is just frustrating to deal with.
How do you think about responding to that? Like, how do you approach it if like someone says something? I feel like for me, I've just sort of tried to ignore it, but sometimes that can be challenging.
Oh, that's a really good question. I feel like I could do a lot better job of responding to it if I were trying to honestly drive change. But I think I ignore it kind of, or I just show that I am not happy about those comments, but I don't say like, don't say that to me. And maybe that's a personality thing. So honestly, if there's any listeners who have found a good way of feeling like they handle that well, I would love to hear. I'm certainly not assertive, but I make it pretty clear by not engaging with it that I'm not pleased to hear that comment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I do exactly the same thing. And I think if we have any listeners that are really good at being assertive, I would love to hear from them because I could probably work on that in like a sport and life context as well.
Totally. Well, honestly, that's a force we're up against. I feel like I've been socialized to be not very assertive and to always kind of defer to other people's emotions. And I certainly do that in these circumstances too.
Yeah, I think we read a quote last time that was talking about women is like having to have this nurturing or kind approach or always just be friendly and happy and all that type of stuff. But I think that's sort of a gender dynamic that exists outside of sport too. And maybe that's something we can unpack later. But I think it's especially pronounced in sport that tends to be like these more male dominated spaces.
Totally. Yeah. And I think kind of on that lens of feeling that you're being more judged or being looked at in your body when you're running, my guard is always up, especially if I'm in unfamiliar environments, especially if it's darker out early morning or late at night. And I know that a lot of other women probably experience that or have had even worse experiences than I've ever had with that. So just wanted to kind of raise that is also a scary thing that we have to think about as women, that men probably don't think about as much, or maybe hasn't crossed their mind in the same way.
Yeah, we did get a quote that said, as a very early morning runner, I'm very mindful about the reality of being a woman outside and alone in the dark. And that's super relevant. For me, I often am running in daylight hours. And so it's a little bit different. But I know a lot of people's work schedules and life schedules make it such that they're going to be in a city in the early morning. And that can be a really vulnerable and scary place to be beyond just the objectification of female bodies. It's actually like a potential safety concern.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Actually, I got one of those flashy light up vests recently. It's actually, so I want to be able to feel more comfortable wearing it. I just, for some reason, it feels like I'm drawing too much attention to myself, although I know it's a good safety thing. So I'm going to start using it more, but my husband got it for me because I do run in the dark often and there's cars and stuff. More on that side of things with the cars. But yeah, I definitely had my fair share of being like, I don't know if I should be on this trail right now, or like I'm going to go for it, but it just feels like if I could be really alone. So it's tricky.
Yeah. I think we'll actually share a couple of recommendations that we got for kind of gear items or safety things if you're a woman or anyone running outside early in the morning, somewhere in the dark. We really recommend using different location sharing services with, loved ones. So like tell your significant other or a close friend or a family member if you're going for a run somewhere unfamiliar and they can track you. And then there's also, I think Strava has like a beacon that can send out pings for exactly where you are during a run. And then I think, Elena, you said you also use the Garmin InReach for like backcountry stuff. Right?
Yeah, I've liked the InReach a lot. And when I did a big adventure, I turned it on where, you could track me the entire time. And I had set messages I could send at different points. And I was staying at a lot of campgrounds or even doing some wild camping. And yeah, that made me feel a lot better. But I will also say on that too, I think sometimes I get in my head about this idea of being in danger because so many people are projecting on me that there is so much danger for women. So like, for example, I think the best way to phrase that is like when I've done these adventures, my parents, my mom in particular, is like, you're crazy. Don't do this. Why would you ever want to do such a thing? And I've had to think through and be like, well, there's risk in the world. There's risk biking. There's risk driving a car. There's risk in me going alone and doing these things. But I'm going to handle the risk as I would do it with this InReach or my other ways of managing it. But it gets in my head of like, wow, it must be so crazy of me to think that I'm safe doing this. But it doesn't have to be like that. It's just how also the force against us that women are in danger by doing stuff alone.
Yeah. And I think we're always probably dealing with that tension is like taking the objective risks and challenges into account, but also not getting so anxious about them that you can't do anything cool or badass. And you want to end up being able to do all the things. And I think inherently there's nothing that women can't do that men can do, but figuring out what your right system of safety precautions is probably a way to do that. And I wish we lived in a world where those weren't necessary, but I think we know that they exist. And for that reason, just want to be really mindful of them.
Yeah, absolutely. The next point on that we wrote was just the gender performance of femininity. So on that line of, what assumptions do we have about femininity that people will counter when we're doing endurance-based activities? And we kind of, Katie and I mentioned a few funny stories to each other earlier, but one that came to mind right away is my mom will also joke about me being an endurance athlete as like, I can't possibly then be feminine too. Like, I'm surprised you're not getting married in shorts and a t-shirt and that I actually got a wedding dress. And it's lighthearted. It's all meant in jest, but it's just like the general perceptions of how we think about being both feminine and endurance athletes at the same time.
I've had a very similar experience. And my mom, who I, of course, love so much, was very surprised and maybe not thrilled that the morning of my wedding, I hosted a sprint triathlon with most of my triathlon wedding guests. And she was so concerned that I wasn't going to have my hair dry in time for the hairstylist to like get me ready for the wedding. So we had to plan the whole schedule around like the amount of time it would take me to dry my hair. And she's like, are you sure you really want to do this? You really don't have to do this. Like maybe we shouldn't do this. But honestly, that was like the closest thing to my personality that I did on my wedding day was host a triathlon the morning of it. And I luckily did make it in time to have my hair dry for my updo.
Yeah, I love that. You can do both the triathlon and still have good hair and look nice on your wedding. Both on the same day. That's great.
So these are both kind of lighthearted stories. I do have a story that's like a little bit more negative in thinking about just perceptions of female bodies, especially from outsiders. So at Kona this year, which was women only, I went to a panel it's a very small panel that was hosted, I think, by one of the triathlon teams there. I had a friend who was on Team Zoot, so I went to this talk. And basically, they'd pulled a lot of previous winners of Kona and had them all sit on a panel and answer questions. And one of the questions that came up was forecasting who was going to win the race for the professional women. And there was, I think, 4 women and 1 man on the panel. And the man had won Kona, like, I think probably 4 or 5 times in the 90s. And he goes first, and he basically just starts giving his take on each professional woman's body. And so he's like, so-and-so's too skinny, so-and-so's fit, so-and-so's too skinny, so-and-so's not fit. Those were the 3 categories that he was talking about. And it was literally just sizing up. Like, not fit probably means his definition of not lean or whatever. Too skinny was another thing that he thought a lot about. And then fit was exactly who he thought was going to win. And his predictions were not correct. You know, he said that people were either too skinny or not fit that did do really well. And the people that he said were fit did not do as well. So it just speaks to, like, that's nothing. That doesn't mean anything for performance. But it was so frustrating that, you know, he should know a good amount about, like, maybe these people's training or their background or their history. And the only thing that he wanted to comment on at the women's only Ironman World Championships was how these women looked. And I just remember sitting there and being like, this can't even be real right now. Is this actually happening at this thing that's supposed to be a big women's empowerment event? And instead it was just sizing women up. Again, when people pay attention to that, you feel like they're thinking about it all the time. They probably are. And that's really hard to stomach.
Yeah, that sounds ridiculous. Was there like more outrage? I don't know. Were other people also like, what is going on right now?
It was interesting, actually, because it was probably only 20 to 25 people in the room. So I feel like there wasn't necessarily the backlash that I might have expected if there were more people there. But it was too bad because a lot of the people in the room were kind of beginners at Kona. There are a lot of amateurs that are going to Kona for the first time. And I think they take the words of a professional panel of people that won the race as kind of gospel here. And so I was really concerned about, like, is this going to condition how other people think about these professional athletes? But yeah, there was basically no backlash. And maybe I should have stood up and said something. Again, not great at being assertive in those contexts, but I wish that I had. And again, who am I to say to, like, this winner of the Ironman World Championships multiple times? However, I knew that he was wrong. And it was just kind of frustrating to hear that in this supposedly uplifting space.
Yeah, man. Well, he's getting flamed on our podcast right now. So if he's ever listening,
yes,
we have outrage.
You know who you are.
Know who you are. Yeah. Well, that's ridiculous. And it just reminded me of the story I think I told last time where I was weighed every single day with the hockey team. And it's like, how ridiculous that people latch on to these, like, metrics that are not really helpful in determining performance. And I think it's maybe like the brain just doing its normal black and white kind of thing and not really being able to dig into the nuance. But I definitely felt the effects of that. And it's crazy that we were measuring based off of weight and that was, like, important. But I felt the similar things for body image, of the contrast between a hockey body versus then I was looking at a running body versus the social ideal body. And when I wasn't as cemented in my own confidence as a person in early college, and I think we have so many people that have experienced similar things, like, that was super confusing. Like, I would see, like, one Instagram photo of a really strong hockey player, I'd be like, wow, I want to be just like her. And then I'd see the next image of an elite runner who was, you know, had 6-pack abs and looked really fit but like really lean. And I was like, wow, I want to be just like her. And then I would see, like, a really pretty photo of the girl that all the guys were talking about as, like, the hottest girl on campus. I'd be like, wow, I want to be just like her. And you just can't do it all. So we're kind of in a bind.
Yeah. And you're kind of just, like, dealt the hand that you're dealt. And I think people kind of really get on the wrong path when they start to try to match this ideal. But I feel like we can at least all aspire to just go for that performance, go for that improvement in your sport without trying to manipulate your body to get there. Because again, if you just let it do what it needs to do and you train for your sport, like, your body's going to end up where it needs to be. But it's a tricky position to be in. And I think it's a challenge that women disproportionately do face.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, how have you found yourself able to fight that as you've gone through the journey?
Yeah. I mean, I think, well, the first thing to point out is, like, you are going to internalize these assumptions based on what you're seeing. So you can create a healthy environment for yourself, especially on social media, by, you know, following accounts that uplift you or that are not so body focused and maybe make you feel bad either consciously or subconsciously. Just think very carefully about curating that environment, I guess, is maybe a place that I would start.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel like I also then, if I see an image that's just like a non-realistic ideal, I also just am allowing myself to be very negative about it. Like, that's ridiculous. That's fake. And then I just move on. Just call it out. Yeah. And I mean, that we already mentioned it, but just, like, really, really, really reminding yourself that it's your performance that matters and not the body measures. So if having a scale is triggering, just don't have a scale, throw it out. Maybe have a fun little smash it with an axe or something. Yeah,
throw it out your window. Don't hit anyone in the process.
Yeah, something dramatic. But no, just, like, really reminding yourself that if you're putting in the work and you're feeling yourself well, you'll see the performance gains and trust the process. But the performance measures are what matters way more.
And then I think too, like, figuring out how you define success. I think we're all conditioned to maybe think about body ideals as a form of success. And that's what the entire fitness industry sort of tells you. And again, like, racing and fitness industry, like, there's some overlap. It's not exactly the same, but it's all like, build your dream body, blah, blah, blah. but really thinking more about what those goals look like that are not, body image focused, and then reminding yourself frequently what those are, I think is probably helpful as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, how do you remind yourself? Do you like write it in a journal, or like write it in a mirror? Like what are the positive ways of affirming that to yourself?
Yeah, I'm big into mantras. Do you do mantras? I really like mantras.
I like the idea of mantras, and I've occasionally had mantras, but they're sporadically. So yeah, I like that you're into mantras.
Well, I've had mantras that have just gotten me through races in different ways. And the crucial thing about the mantras is that they are focused on traits or qualities that are really like core to who I am, have nothing to do with body, often have nothing to do with like a specific race outcome. It's not just like qualify for quota. Like that's not really my mantra, but it's just things that I can ground in that really remind me who I am and what like nothing about a race outcome can change and nothing about body image could change or anything like that. So that's probably, I wrote a blog post about my like placid day where I did share my placid mantra that I've used quite frequently since then. But my mantra recently has been, you are loved, you deserve respect, you are Katie Clayton, and you can do anything you put your mind to. And that one just kind of like plays, and it's all things that are true, like, or that I would want to be true. And I think that has really helped me because it's so separate from any of these other indicators that we might care about.
Yeah, that's a great one. I like that. Mine are usually much shorter, but I like really the power woman stance that you create for yourself with that one. I've done same team to remind myself like that my brain and my body are on the same team.
I love that.
But I can't yell at myself in my head so while I'm doing stuff. Well, and also that I'm on the same team as like, the community, and I really thrive. I think I can like really pull energy from the community around me if I'm focused on it. So that one's been really helpful for me too. But I think those are find something that works for you and just play around with it and focus on what your version of success is. That's a great advice.
I love that. Okay. And then our last tip for just strategies that are helpful is I'm a big proponent of therapy. I talk to a therapist. It's awesome. It gives me a space to process these things that are challenging. And I think people don't like often enough talk about how valuable this can be, but we can think about the brain as a body part, and like just like you're going to go get body work and work with a sports chiropractor, you can also work on your brain. So if you feel like these thoughts are really challenging for you, I think that's a great place to start.
Definitely. And even if not, I mean, I'm also a proponent of just like having therapy as just maintenance in your life. Like you always could have, everyone needs therapy, and I've really enjoyed my experience with it. I've known many people who have. So yeah, big proponent of therapy.
Definitely. All right. Are we ready to transition to our next bucket for challenges we're up against?
Yeah, let's do it.
So we're going to talk now about balance, which I think based on the quotes we got is something that is disproportionately a challenge for women. So we're going to read two quotes. I will take the first one. It says, balance is a myth. You hear about women trying to balance their lives with children, family responsibilities, a career, athletics, sleep, self-care, etc. We are told we can do it all, or we feel like we have to do it all. But at what cost? You cannot balance everything. And while trying to do that, instead of being badass at a few things, you are going to be half-assed at a lot of things and very tired and full of guilt at the same time. So instead of trying to be more balanced, try to be more present in whatever stage of life you're in. Look at life more as a pendulum where at one apex of the swing, you are sleep deprived and taking care of a newborn with no energy or headspace to do anything else, to the other end of the pendulum where you are dropping your children off at college and you find yourself with all this time that you can now focus on yourself. In between those two polar swings, you might be able to add in other life opportunities. So I think this was a really valuable quote, and it's perspective that like, we're sort of at this earlier stage of life. We've not had kids yet or sent them off to college, but I think we know that we maybe have a little bit more time and space to do our activities, but that's going to change. And so thinking about maybe how we can't always perfectly balance everything, and at a certain point, something will have to give. That's a nice reframe for me.
Yeah, I think figuring out what I will move on the spectrum from half-assed to badass, which I like that spectrum, will be an interesting challenge. And I've thought about that before, but as you said, like the things we're doing are obligations to ourselves. So I like fill all my buckets with obligations to myself, whether that's a relationships bucket or a health bucket or like a career bucket or personal passions bucket. And yeah, you're going to get more and more buckets as you go along. So it's challenging to figure out that right balance. The next one that's also relevant, it says, women still have more traditional roles, even in the best family dynamics, when it comes to childcare, domestic chores, and overall running the household, on top of working full-time jobs. It makes carving out time without guilt to focus on me and my well-being a challenge. Some of my favorite male training partners will think nothing of heading out for a 6 to 8 hour ride on a Saturday without a thought to what needs to be taken care of with the kids, groceries, etc. I simply can't do that, even though my husband helps out a ton. Yeah, man, that's interesting and I think very relevant. And I know that everyone has their own family dynamic, and we have, I mean, Katie and I think would both say that our partners are super supportive, but there are just still changing tides of women's balance in the household, and that hasn't changed all the way to a full equal partnership in many circumstances, and that makes it really hard to go out and do a 6 to 8 hour ride if you're having fun, or just hit the training that you want to hit. So definitely recognize the balance is not equal there.
Yeah, I think there's like some pretty cool research papers. I forget if it's like in econ research or whatever it is, and I'm going to try to find it so I can link it in the show notes, but basically, people have tried to quantify the amount of time and energy women spend on generally running households. And it's often things that are really hard to quantify in terms of hours, because it has to do with like the family calendar and managing the house and things that just cross. I think this came out in this quote where there's a lot of thoughts about what needs to be taken care of with kids, groceries, et cetera. And I'd say, like, at least in my household, I have one of the most supportive partners in the world. But in terms of the things that just need to kind of get done in the given week, I think my brain is driving a lot of those. So it's like, okay, we need to grocery shop for this and meal plan for that and do the laundry and this. And if I ask for help on anything, like, my partner is so amazing about doing it. But even just that, like, scheduling and logistics headspace is something big that I'm sure will exponentially change as soon as there are kids and other stuff in the picture.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, it's definitely like it's the management, right? Like, the management is a job that people are paid and hired to do at many companies. And it's that like emotional labor and organizational management that I think often still falls on women, which takes a tremendous amount of energy. I've listened to a few things on this. The first one I would recommend, it's an old podcast now, as in they haven't come out with episodes in a while, but Lauren Fleshman and her then partner, Jesse Thomas, had this awesome podcast called Work, Play, Love, where they talked a lot about balancing their training with raising kids, as they're both professional athletes and they were trading off different times when one was primary parent versus the other was a primary parent. So I think learning how to have these really frank conversations about what this work is and being able to articulate the work and then share what the balance of responsibility is very helpful, especially in partnerships.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have to check that out. I haven't listened to them before, but I think, like, as we think about our lives evolving, trying to build in those tools so it's not something that causes a lot of tension is probably a really great place to start.
Yeah, absolutely.
How would you say that balance works in your household? So how do you think about, like, getting your training in and managing everything that needs to go on and work and all those things in between?
Yeah, I mean, I would also say that I have one of the most supportive partners ever. Will is great, and I think he really also finds a lot of joy and purpose in doing some of that managerial work. So right now, I would say it feels like relatively evenly split, which is great. Like, he often does a lot of the grocery shopping, but we might sit there and talk about what we need to get together. I usually have the list of the things that we want to get done, and I say, hey, we have to get this done today. But then there's other things that he just drives on his own. So right now, I think it's really ideal because we've had a lot of these conversations. I do think that it'll be super fascinating when we have kids to see how that changes, because there's also things that, like, logistically he can't do. Like, he can't, like, breastfeed our babies and he won't be able to carry our kids. So I think it's an evolving process. We have a lot of conversation, though, and that is something that I don't take for granted. So I'm very grateful for that. What about for you?
Yeah, I think similarly, like, have one of the best partners in the entire world. And I'm so grateful that he can support me through all of these things. And again, like, sometimes even if I'm thinking through all the things that need to happen in a given week, I just have to ask. And he's amazing about all of that. But I also am scared about the kid stage, just because I think the nature of the work that both of us do will probably involve me being home a little bit more and having a little bit more of a traditional split, just because my work is generally more flexible. And so figuring out how that looks in the context of me also carving out time for training and sport in some capacity is something that we might just have to kind of cross the bridge when we come to it. But we can at least probably sketch out some of our goals and intentions as we go into doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. I know it's funny because Will often jokes that he's the house husband sometimes when he worked remotely before I was working remotely. So he was doing, like, the laundry and stuff like that because he was already at home. But it does seem like if you are already at home, because of that flexibility, you're just going to be naturally doing more of that work, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it just requires conversation. Mm-hmm. There was also, like, a really funny, I found it funny, I don't know if other people found it funny, but there was a New York Times article that came out that was basically, the headline was, one partner is training for the marathon and the other partner does everything else. And it was kind of following along with these different couples that had a first-time marathon trainer, was realizing how much time, energy, and effort it took to hit those training goals amidst life. And so the other partner was picking up all of the slack and complaining about the fact that this person was just training for a marathon and yet they're doing everything else, which honestly sounds relatable. And I feel that guilt sometimes, but I think we just have to have very open conversations about the best way to balance that.
And I think there's an ebb and flow too, right? Like I find that in partnerships, it's never actually going to be 50-50 all the time. Sometimes it's 60-40 and sometimes it's 70-30 and sometimes it's 80-20. But as long as on net, like you live out your entire lives and at the end things feel 50-50, I hope that that's like the outcome. And I think we probably both know that when we're training for like a major A race and our husbands are being more of that like crew role, it is going to be a little bit different. And training for these long things can be a little bit of like a selfish endeavor. And we have the flexibility to do it now because that's what the balance breakdown is looking like. But we'll swing back in the other direction when we're like pregnant many times for all the kids.
Oh, I'm sure. And I mean, I would actually love to deep dive into that more maybe later, but I struggle a lot with that selfishness concept of like, is it selfish for me to be pursuing these athletic goals? And I've voiced that before to my therapist and to others and to Will. And I think the interesting thing that I've always gotten back is like, rarely when a man goes and achieves something big and extraordinary are people there being like, wow, that was really selfish of that guy. And I think I've just internalized all of this expectation of how I should behave and what I should do to build a career or to raise a family or anything, honestly. And it just makes me feel very selfish sometimes. And I really struggle with that. So yeah, I think that's something to maybe deep dive in maybe more later. Sorry to bring up my therapy on this session, but I think that it's just reminded me when we were talking about that, but it's a bit of a challenging dynamic to get yourself in the right headspace to go after these goals when you're feeling like maybe you're not providing the best experience for your partner or your loved ones.
I'm so glad that you brought that up because I think I've always felt that as well, but have maybe never connected the more gender dynamic. Because I think I'm always just like, objectively, is this a selfish thing to do? But I think you're right that maybe there's a double standard. While for men in doing the sport, it's not as selfish. And I can only imagine, I mean, based on these quotes that we're getting, I think probably moms can get a lot of flack for pursuing this stuff where maybe dads don't get as much because people assume that, you know, a mom should be the primary child rearer or whatever, when in reality, like, even if you have to carry the baby for 9 months, that doesn't mean that you have to have the same parenting load as a male partner does. But it's a big struggle. We should definitely deep dive on that one. And I think right now, maybe something to just remind ourselves is like, we deserve to be here as long as you've talked about it with your partner and figured out how to make that work. It's okay and it's great and we should be doing it. But I think the good news is that like, if you're thinking a lot about whether it's selfish, you're probably like self-aware enough to not be selfish about it. So that's a good sign.
I've also thought about that too. And I also never made the gender dynamic connection until my therapist made that connection for me. And I was like, oh, yeah, maybe. I don't know. But yeah, I think I overthink it a lot. So we can come back to it.
You once again.
Yeah, go to therapy. All right, should we jump into our next one?
Yeah, that's kind of a nice segue actually to talk about the medical system. So this was something that we actually wanted to talk about in our first episode on the female body, but we got too wrapped up in our own stories to get there. So we've pushed it to the forces we're up against because I think this actually is a pretty serious force that especially women can encounter. So I wanted to read one quote that we got here. This is actually like a good story. Someone said, recently I struggled with some unexplained underperformance issues. My resting heart rate shot up, my pace slowed down, I missed some periods, my sleep quality got worse, and I generally just felt super disconnected from my body. When I first went to the GP, they weren't all that helpful. They said that with someone who trains 4 to 5 times a week, it could be expected that I'd miss a period or two, or that it was normal for the body to go through these fluctuations. I had to persevere and get a second and a third opinion to find out that I had some vitamin deficiencies and underlying inflammation from an old infection. It was also a prompt to make sure that I was getting enough protein and iron in my diet, but it felt like medical awareness of female athletes' bodies and performance was really lacking, and that was really challenging. It felt like I was going crazy when I was trying to explain that these changes weren't normal for me when all the medical information said I was still in the healthy range.
Man, yeah, that is tough and also really relatable. I've actually had a similar experience where, and I mean, I think it's common in training, like people have their down periods and up periods, but I had a period of time when I was just getting into endurance training and I wasn't really doing it in a smart way. I was just trying to work with a coach and, you know, I was doing a bunch of mountaineering adventures and I was still trying to hit the training that I was prescribed perfectly, but then also adding on my bike adventures and my mountaineering adventures. And it was probably too much. It didn't feel like too much at the time. I think I could get through all of it and I didn't feel horrible, but I kind of hit this point where I hit a wall. Like I had one day where all of a sudden the wheels totally came off of the bus. I felt like I could barely move running, and it was just weird. I gave myself rest. Like I was going to give myself a couple days to recover, but I just didn't get any better. And I was still able to do stuff, but it just didn't feel fresh. And I ended up getting these really bad breakouts on my jawline, on my chin, which is pretty noticeable as hormonal acne. And I had other symptoms, like I would eat food for lunch and then feel like I had to fall asleep like immediately. But I was also hungry all the time. And it was just really hard for me to get any proper information. I went to a doctor. They're like, maybe you shouldn't train as much, like just give yourself some rest, which I was giving myself rest, but it still didn't help me understand like how much rest or when it was going to go away. And I did all this Google searching, and I started thinking, okay, maybe it was an overtraining thing, but like these symptoms are weird. And it wasn't until I found a random woman who, I mean, I don't know who she was, but I wish I could tell who this YouTuber was, but she did a YouTube video on her experience with overtraining and her hormonal acne that she got, and feeling hungry all the time and feeling like her legs were just really heavy, and just how she got through that. And I mean, it did require just like rest and taking a step back from training and focusing on my feeling again. But I felt crazy. And like, I think that was the main thing. Is like the emotional side of it was almost worse than the physical side of it, because I just didn't know what was wrong, and I didn't have anyone to relate with my experiences with and say like, yeah, that happened to me too, and this is some of the symptoms. So just really relate with anyone who's struggling with like weird symptoms and unable to get answers, because the uncertainty is what hurts more than even the physical stuff sometimes.
Yeah, and I think as women, we have a big tendency, at least I have a big tendency to like gaslight yourself a little bit and say like, well, maybe I'm just not fit, or like maybe, you know, it probably isn't something real, because that's often the information that we get back from the traditional medical system, especially like for this person's experience. They had talked about how their blood work was like mostly normal. And so it was like, okay, you're good. Like we don't need anything else here. When in reality, there's just so much more nuance. And I think we can think about how stress hormones interact with all of this, and how just a lot of things that are really hard to capture with objective indicators can still have such a huge impact on performance, and how maybe like the Western medical system isn't always set up to support people through that. And especially athletes, like thinking about how our ideas of reference ranges for different things that you should be testing for in blood work aren't necessarily based on female athletes. Like you should probably be really high on the end of the iron range if you want to be performing at your best. And even if you're inside of normal, let's say you've like declined from where you were, that can have a huge impact on performance. And we know that anemia is so common. So I think all of that is really a challenge that we just have to reckon with when we're facing these downtimes.
Yeah, if anyone wants my rant on iron in the United States or in our healthcare system, just email me and I'll give you a multi-page frustrated information. But yeah, I think that's tricky. And I guess my question to you, Katie, would be like, how do you now advocate for yourself in the medical environment, knowing some of the challenges that you're up against?
I feel like a recurring theme of this episode is like, I am not that assertive. So I would say that this is something I probably have to work on. But it can help to, first of all, just like make a list of everything that you're going through, so that when you go into a medical setting, like I think it can be easy, depending on maybe your doctor's amazing, maybe they're not, but for people to kind of discount different symptoms. I remember I similarly also have sort of recently experienced some like kind of weird underperformance challenges. And the first questions that I was asked were basically just like, well, are you PMSing? And I was like, nope, it's not actually that. It's been like 6 weeks. So like maybe I was PMSing once or twice in that time. But being like, no, this is exactly what has been going on. This is how long it's been going on. I think that that's at least a helpful place to start. And then doing a little bit of your own research too on like what you think it could be, what you might want to test to figure that out. But it's hard. I'm not really good at that type of advocating. And I think I probably need to work on it, because that's the best way to get the best care that you need.
Yeah, definitely.
One thing I'll add to that too is I had talked about in the first and second episode experiencing REDS in high school, and then having an endocrinologist just say like, oh, just go on birth control, and we can now cover up any signal that like you have REDS, and then that leading to like multiple stress fractures and other bad injuries for 5 or 6 years. Like I would say that was a pretty big failure on the part of the medical system that I'm still not really over, because I feel like I could have avoided a lot of those negative outcomes if I'd just known a little bit earlier.
Yeah, definitely. And I think a big aspect of why this is so challenging is just because we've had such little research done on women and female athletes specifically. So I'm optimistic that's changing, but a recent review, when we have the stat, but a recent review found that only 34% of studies in 6 prominent exercise and sport journals from 2014 to 2020 included women, and only 6% of those publications were conducted exclusively on female athletes. So yeah, we have a big gap, and I do think this is getting better. I know, Katie, you've done some work with FASTER, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so quick plug for the Female Athlete Science and Translational Research Team at Stanford. They are one of the few organizations that's dedicated to doing research on female athletes. There's also the Female Athlete Program, I believe it's called, at Boston Children's Hospital. Those are kind of 2 areas of this cutting-edge research, but it's a pretty small space. It's not very well funded. It does not have that much attention at it compared to the broader network of like sports science research. And so I think there's a ton of work that we need to be doing here. So my hope is that like in 10 to 15 to 20 years, there will be such a more robust understanding of all of these issues, and maybe female athletes will not like get gaslit when they go to try to get help for things. But it's currently still a pretty big challenge. And I think because of those gaps in research, there's also a lot of misinformation out there about even how we should be training or approaching different elements of sport. So, for example, there's a lot of talk about intermittent fasting or like fasted training, which is basically not eating before you train. And anything we know about that is based on research that's exclusively been done on male athletes. And then when you look at it for women, there are catastrophic hormonal consequences of persistently being in this underfueled state. So it's just frustrating that like you'll see these really gimmicky articles about like, oh, everyone should do fasted training. And it's like, actually, that study was conducted on 3 white men ages 18 to 22. And that's the only thing we know about it.
Yikes. Yeah, I mean, I've definitely seen those like YouTube clickbaity, I lost X amount of pounds on intermittent fasting, or like similar with the keto diets, or like I feel like a lot of men, I don't know how many men, but I definitely knew some men in my circles who were on the carnivore diet for a little bit. I don't know if that's even research backed at all, but yeah, seemingly there's some bad science out there.
Yeah, so just make sure to do your research. And I would say 2 quick plugs for places to start that research is I really like the book Roar by Stacey Sims. I think it's a very accessible way to start just understanding some differences in female physiology that explain how we can think about exercise. And then I also would recommend Up to Speed by Christine Yu, which is a great book that basically just covers everything that we know and don't know about female versus male athletes. And as you'll read in the book, like there's a lot that we don't know, but I think it's a great start to just figure out where do we want to conduct more research. She has an incredible chapter actually on female anatomy in cycling seats and how like we know so little about like cycling saddles that are actually comfortable for women because most of them are designed by and for men, and how there are female professional cyclists who have had to have serious plastic surgery because of damage done by these male designed bike saddles. So I remember I said wow out loud like 8 times by reading this chapter, but I would highly recommend it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm saying whoa as you're saying it. I haven't read that one, so that's on my list. I have read Roar, and I also really enjoyed that book, so definitely ditto on that one. Cool. Well, that's a big cycle for the medical challenges, which I'm sure we could talk more about. So if you have any other experiences specific with the medical system, we'd love to hear that. But I think we should jump into maybe our last big topic for this episode, which is just the general culture and assumptions that female athletes experience. I think a big theme of this was just women being taken seriously as athletes and the forces that prevent women from being taken seriously. So we had one quote that we really liked that came in that said, "I often run, hike, or ski with my cis male partner, and there's often an assumption when we rent gear or meet others outdoors that he knows more about what I want and can do than I do. Generally speaking, that oft-repeated experience is emblematic of a culture that often assumes that because I am mixed, a woman, and don't come from an outdoorsy background, that I must not be capable of knowing my own mind, needs, wants, and priorities in outdoor spaces." Yeah, I think that is interesting, and I can totally see how that plays out. I think I've seen it just in terms of body language and how people behave when I'm with men in a group, and it's just assumed that they're the group leaders, even if I might be leading the group. And I think that's not just in the endurance world either. I've experienced that, and it's like when people assume that the woman is there to deliver coffee at a meeting. I think you could have a whole nother conversation of this in the career world. But yeah, that is definitely something that women are up against when you're in these outdoors or endurance communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this speaks to how powerful it can be to go out just with groups of women. We've talked about this on, I think, the last episode on community and sport, because then like there's no default guy that everyone's going to look to and be like, oh, they must be leading this experience. They must know everything that's there. Because I similarly have found that whenever I'm in a mixed gender group, even if I know the very most in that group about what we're doing, there's an assumption that I probably know the least, or I'm just sort of along for the ride and getting carried down the trail like with my parasol, which is not actually what's happening. So it's something that I think it's frustrating, because I feel like then you start to doubt yourself in these spaces and you might start to feel unwelcome or intimidated. These are themes that we'll come back to in the next episode as well, and we're just talking about like how it makes you feel. But on that negative side, I think you can definitely question your own power in these spaces when there's these assumptions about what you can do.
Yeah, totally. And I feel like get a little reflective again for a second. I guess I'm going back into therapy. But I've noticed how this has rubbed off on me over time, where my gut reaction now sometimes when I come across other men who are also competent in the outdoors or projecting competence in the outdoors is that I feel like I need to prove myself so that they can, because I'm assuming that they're assuming that I'm less competent. And so I'm not like going up to them being like, hey, I'm actually a big deal. Like, I know what I'm doing. But I have that gut reaction where I want to be like, hey, like, I know what I'm doing. I want to show that I know what I'm doing to you. And I wish I didn't. And I think that's because I've experienced this so many times where I've been socialized to recognize that people are probably assuming that I don't know what I'm doing.
I totally see that. Yeah. I feel like when I'm with women, I never feel the need to walk into a room and start talking about like what I've done or what I've accomplished. I don't like when people do that. And yet I similarly feel the pressure to do it when I feel like I'm a little bit under threat. I have many experiences where like I've been on a backpacking trip with a group of women and we run into some guy that's talking us up, and I feel the need to be like, yep, well, we're on day 4 and we've covered 82 miles or something, just because I want them to know that like we know what we're doing out here. We're really serious. We can do big miles. We can carry heavy loads, all that type of stuff. Because I don't think our assumptions about that are fantastical. I think that they're quite real. And I think we probably experienced those microaggressions in real context too. Like I remember walking into a bike shop a year ago or something, and I just needed a multi-tool to stick in my saddlebag because I was going on a bike trip. And I'm just standing looking at all the multi-tools, and this guy working in the bike shop comes up to me and he goes, hey, are you like learning to do some bike maintenance? Do you want to start out with a tool? And I'm like, I know how to do bike maintenance. I just need a tool to stick in my saddlebag. That's why I'm taking this small tool. But I know how to do a lot of different things with my bike. And it was just so frustrating that he assumed like, here she is coming in to be handy on her bike with this little wrench. Like, no, that's not what I'm here for.
Like, oh, cute little Katie, you're learning some bike maintenance?
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm going to take my little mini tool for my little baby hands and I can just go.
Oh, that's outrageous.
So I wanted to be like, no, I'm actually going on a 600-mile bike trip. And so I just want to have a lightweight tool to take with me.
Yeah, that is outrageous. I feel like I've gotten my fair share of just like degrading comments, but they're like meant to be comical, I guess. I don't know. But I was doing a big bike ride with friends. If anyone's done the Seattle to Portland ride, it's a couple 100 miles from Seattle to Portland. And we were rocking it, honestly. We were just like having a great time, cranking, like doing our thing. And we passed this huge group of guys. And I think for the most part, they were fine. But there was like one guy who was clearly really upset about being passed by us. And on the next hill, he just decided to gun it. And of course, we passed him again, like right after this happened. But he like gunned it on this hill really hard. And we were laughing and chatting about, whatever. And as he passes us, he says, less giggling, more spinning. And we were just like, what a weird thing to say. There was like no need to say anything, but also the fact that you're just wanting to tell us that we're not good enough as you're passing us, only to be passed by us again, was just like, I wonder what's going on in his head. But yeah, it's just this feeling that we're constantly being degraded by men in the endurance circles because we are not as competent.
Yep. I've had a very similar experience where if I will pass a mammal riding and then he'll go back and try to pass me, and there is nothing that gets me more frustrated than when that happens. And I will always inevitably be like, okay, I just showed you 65%. Do you want to see 100% of Katie Clayton? And I will like drop that man so hard. But it happens, it happens all the time. And it just, it frustrates me. I wish I could just do my zone 2 ride in peace without like having to jockey for my spot on the road.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, it seems like a commonplace experience for many people, but at least it can be humorous when we look at it in some of the funny things that people have said to us. So
yes, and we know that we're badass and we know that we're fast and we can drop them if we want to, which is also very cool.
Yeah, so I guess to other female athletes who have experienced that, I'm so glad that everyone's still out there doing badass things and just keep dropping those people when they're being annoying.
Drop the mammals, exactly.
Yes.
All right. Well, I think we made it to the end. This was a lot of content today, but it was always really fun. It was great to do. And I think next week we are going to roll our final episode of the planned Female Athlete Stories series. So that's going to be how it makes us feel. And so we have a lot of different elements of like how great it can make you feel to be a female athlete and also how we encounter more challenges in that space as well. And then after that, I don't know, I have a feeling that this podcast is going to keep going because we've been having a lot of fun. So we're going to probably start soliciting some additional ideas for future episodes. We're going to do some guest episodes, but do stay tuned because it's been a lot of fun for both of us.
Yes, and write in if you have any specific ideas for what you want to see covered. But it's been a blast. And yeah, we made it to the end. So thanks, everyone.